there, I'm Ryan, and today we are going to work on an acrylic landscape lesson. All of the tools and materials will be listed in the video description, and if you'd like help with the drawing process, I'll have the traceable up over on Patreon, along with the reference photo for color matching. With that said, let's jump into it. Today we're going to be working on a really neat erupting volcano landscape. The first brush we'll be working with is a 1-inch flat-headed brush, and I'm using this because it has some nice sharp edges for working around our volcano, and it does have a lot of surface area, so it can pick up quite a bit of paint for blending these larger areas in a rather quick amount of time. Now, as per usual, before we grab any actual pigment, we are going to dip the bottom third of our brush right here in some water and wipe off the excess. We're doing this because the water is going to condense the bristles, and it's also going to extend the wet life of the paint so we can blend much larger areas for a significantly longer period of time, which, when working with acrylics, is really quite useful. That said, we don't want it to be actually wet because the water will thin the pigment, and we don't want to thin it too much. So here we are just taking off the excess. So we're going to begin here with a very limited palette of Mars Black, Titanium White, and Cerulean Blue. We will be using additional colors for the lava and the fire here, but we'll cover that a little bit later. Start easy, ease our way into it, and really just have some fun. With that, we are going to begin in the background and the sky, then we'll work our clouds. On top of that, we'll work our volcano on top of that. As a general rule of thumb, you want to start with the farthest subject in the painting, and then work your way forwards. So that is exactly what we're going to do. We'll begin here by grabbing some of our Cerulean Blue, put that on our palette. We'll grab about half that in Titanium White using one corner of our brush. Then using the other corner, we'll grab about half that of Mars Black. And we're particularly using our corners there because we really don't want to start diluting all of our pigments with other pigments. We want to try to keep them as clean as we can. So we got a little bit of blue in there, we got a little bit of white in there, but for the most part, we're in a good place. So here we go, we have this nice muted cerulean blue. And now I'm going to work that right here around our clouds, around our volcano. It's going on quite nicely. One thing with acrylics is that they are water-based. Generally, they are semi-transparent, and you'll have to do a couple of layers. Generally, I do think that is the biggest issue for beginners in getting their paintings to look great, just going over things a couple of times. However, we didn't use a lot of water in this mixture, so we actually have a fairly competent application here. Doesn't look like we'll have to do too much additional layering. That said, I'm going to grab a little bit more, say, okay, you know what, we have more of a bright look under here. We'll apply that. And this, I can tell, is a bit more thin. Slightly more transparent. You can definitely tell right here, as it's more bright. You can see the white of the canvas showing through. So I'm glad that we were able to see both kind of applications in these early stages, just so you know that this can happen. That's okay, we just go over it with more paint. And if more paint doesn't do it because your brush is still too damp, don't worry about it. Just wait 5 to 10 minutes, let it dry, and then come back to it. With that, I'm quite happy with both of those applications. Now I'm going to take more Mars Black, work that into our mixture, a little bit more Cerulean Blue. So we're essentially just working our way away from the Titanium White. And now I'm going to start applying this right around our previous applications. It's very dark, and I'm leaving this small line in between our first blue and our second blue. This is very much intentional, as that's going to be a much more detailed process, and we're going to want to go through and do that with a smaller brush. Here again is another great example, by the way, of pigment when it's quite thin and therefore transparent. Now, we can, again, let that dry, or to kind of counteract the amount of water in the mixture, we can just add more paint. And that's what we're going to try to do first. So I'm not grabbing any more water, I'm just mixing up more pigment. We'll grab a hint of titanium white, because we've probably used all that was in that initial mixture. And as we move farther up in the sky, we can make it slightly darker, because we are moving around, or rather away from the light, which is emanating A from here, but B from the horizon as well. So the higher up we get, the darker we can get. It's a little bit brighter in the reference photo, but I think it's a-okay to take artistic liberties, make your painting the way you want it to be, and have fun with it. So that's exactly what we're doing. So, moving my way up to the top, of course, leaving the larger smoke area in here, which we are going to want to make a little bit darker than this. So don't make this the absolute darkest pigment. Give it a little bit of room. That way you can still play and continue to build contrast later on. That is something that's important to keep in the back of your head when you are starting your painting. While I know a lot of us just innately feel the need to go as bright and as dark as we can, incorporate those really stark pigments, well, you know, that can be fun. It does limit you later on. So try to work with more gray mixtures, try to work with things that aren't hyper stark, and you're going to find yourself in a much better position later on in the piece. There we go. And then I think we'll have this cloud get a little bit more thin as you move up. So more of this light, which is, you know, creating this blue, can be seen from up here. So I'm actually going to add some extra cerulean blue, some extra titanium white. Not too much, but enough. Don't want it to be as bright as what we have down here, but definitely brighter than what we've been working with. And we're doing this to create some diversity in the sky, A, but B, to also make it so the smoke at the top will stand out more. We're creating a contrast, right? We need one color to look brighter for the other color to look darker. So here we are, kind of creating a gradient in the opposite direction, one would assume. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it's going to make the painting a lot nicer in the end. And then I'm going over all of it with this very soft horizontal stroke as I get towards the end. This is a great technique for taking streaky applications out of your painting. The more pressure you apply with your brush, the more streaky it will be. The more soft you apply your brush, the more soft it will be. So generally, when we first apply that paint, we apply a lot of pressure, and then we want to lessen it. So that's exactly what we're doing. As I noted earlier, this was a little bit thin. So I'm going to go over this again. Gives us an opportunity to make light corrections, change things up a little bit. Here I look at the bottom and I say, you know what, I like it. It's dark, that's good. Stands out from that, but it might be a little bit too dark. Again, if we brighten it, we can make the smoke look darker. So let's try that. I'm also still, for the most part, avoiding those connective edges. Just having fun with it. And again, one of the biggest mistakes I see beginners make is not going back and doing additional layers. Those additional layers allow you to correct. They teach you, they allow you to remix your colors so you remember them, and they make the piece look a lot more professional. Oftentimes we kind of, in the beginning, end up with applications we like quite a bit, but the layers are a little bit too thin, and we say, oh, you know what, I'll keep it, I think it looks good. And that's one thing you do want to avoid. Even if it looks good, do it again. That way, you retain that information. You can do it the next time you go to paint, and you'll just become a much stronger painter significantly more quickly through that process. So, just different things to consider. You also notice that I'm getting a little bit rough around the edges of our smoke. Don't worry about that. It's fairly inevitable. And we're going to cover it up. That is why we work background to foreground first. But so far, I really, really like our applications here. I'm going to now let all of this dry, and then we'll come in with what is called a wet into dry blend, something you'll be doing a lot with acrylics. And this is all wet into wet, but it doesn't have to be, and we'll explain why in the next clip. So I'll see you in just a second. For the next step, we'll be switching to a round pointed brush like you can see right here. The edges are quite soft, so you can use the edge to do a soft blend, but you can also use the sharp tip to deliver some very fine detail. It's an incredibly versatile brush, and it'll be great for this next step in the clouds because you'll need both a soft application and a sharp application. Now, as you may be able to see, I did go ahead and do another layer right here, another layer right there, just to ensure that it was nice and thick. But now we are going to work into these edges with this round pointed brush, which is again about 1/4 of an inch. So our first step is to remix more of this color that we used here, and I do have a little bit of that still showing up on the edge of my palette. Here we have that color, but I always like to leave a little bit on the palette from previous mixtures. That way we have a good reference point. So I'll start with some Mars Black, some of our Cerulean Blue. Mix those two together. Of course, we need a hint of Titanium White. And this is starting to look good, but it's not quite dark enough. So we'll add a hint more Mars Black. And I think this will be great because even if it is a little bit bright, that is okay, as the edges of clouds generally have more light showing through them as they are more thin. So with that, we're now going to take our new pigment here. We're going to apply it right along the edge, and I can already tell that that is too dark, which is interesting. Opposite of what we thought, but that's why we always like to start with smaller mixtures and test. So there we go, we brighten it up. We'll try this. And you know what? This looks significantly better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to now move this darker mixture lightly on top of our previous mixture, and we'll start to create some interesting shapes. I have a little bit of water on my brush to make sure that we do get a slight blend over this, but it's also still thick enough that you don't really see the edge from this previous application, right? And this is where things start to look a little more cloud-like, a little less abstract. So grab a little bit more water. As I am running out of paint, grab more paint. We'll just come back up to the top here. And this is where we can get very creative with it. The more water you add to your brush, the more transparent your pigments are going to be, so you can do better wet into dry blends. So all of this is dry and we can't actually blend into it. We can thin this darker pigment to the point where when it goes on top of this, it's semi-transparent. You can see this through it, and therefore it looks like a soft blend from one pigment to the next. And that's really our goal here. So let's try to make a subtle cloud right out here. This isn't necessarily in the reference photo, but it's a good lesson, and I think it'll look quite good as well. So I'm starting over on that edge, I'm moving it out, and then here you can see I'm doing a slight tap with the edge of my brush because it's soft, it's not that it's not that sharp, pointed portion of it. And here you can see we're just moving it out, slowly gets semi-transparent, essentially dissolves and just becomes an application of water, and therefore we have this new, much softer looking application. It's not as dark as this, doesn't have any hard edges, it just makes the scene look more visually captivating. Now let's mix more of that pigment yet again. We're going to do small amounts, that way we get in practice of finding this color. That way the next time we go to make a painting like this, we know what to do. We know where to start, we can feel confident. The goal with these lessons is always to teach you more than just how to paint a specific piece, but how to paint in general, how to take these ideas and work with them in your own paintings in the future. So that's what we're doing. With that, here you can see I'm trying to get a nice thick application at the bottom, covering up this fully exposed area of the canvas. And then I'm going to go back around the edges, a little bit of a tap, a little bit of a stroke, using less and less pressure as I move farther away from the body of this initial application. And it gets more and more transparent. Let's grab a little bit of water. Let's grab a little bit of paint, let's grab a little bit more water, making it quite thin. And this is something you only want to do once that base layer is dry though, because if you add this much water to a wet base layer, you're probably just going to rip up a lot of paint. We don't want that. So there you can see, starting to fade off into the top. A lot of the composition in this painting is heavily reliant on the actual volcano though, so the clouds are going to look a little incomplete until we have everything else worked in. And that's a really important thing to consider when you're painting. When you have a subject right in the middle that you really want to stand out, generally you don't want to make everything else look too complicated or too full. Otherwise, the painting in the end is just going to be a little dizzy. Your eye's not going to know where to settle. So we make sacrifices. We say, okay, you know what, if I want the foreground to be this captivating, I'm going to make the background a little less captivating so that the foreground can actually stand out. And that is the case with these clouds. We're not going with anything hyper visually notable. We're not going with any hyper complex designs. We're just making it look subtly natural. Getting some more water. Blend this out. Just like that. Now let's move over to that edge, and then we'll see if we want to come back into this area. Let's get a little closer though. So yet again, I'm going to start by making my brush a little bit damp. We'll grab some of our Mars Black, Cerulean Blue, hint of Titanium White. Titanium White's going to thicken the pigment quite a bit, by the way. It innately is a very thick pigment, so you don't have to do as much layering when you incorporate it in your mixes. Your general colors like Cerulean Blue, your Cadmium Reds, your primary colors, those are all inherently going to be a bit more thin and require more layers. But whenever you can incorporate Mars Black and Titanium White, you thicken that pigment and you make your life a little bit easier. That said, again, nothing wrong with layers. Don't stray away from them. Here, that initial application was a little bit, just a little bit too dark. So I made things brighter, added some titanium white. The issue is now that this is a little bit too gray. So what do we do when we make our mixes too gray? We add back in hue, we add back in color. So here's some cerulean blue. There we go. Oh, and now we have this beautiful mix between this and this. Really soft, easy blend. I like that a lot. Let's make our pigment a bit more transparent. Grab some extra water for our brush. Soften this. You can have hard edges if you want for the bottom of clouds, or you can just kind of have them start to disappear. Up to you. But I think that looks quite natural, and I like it a lot. We might throw in another little cloud right down here. Just very, very subtle. Almost unnoticeable. Those details are really what's going to make the painting great in the end. But with that, very happy, very happy. We're going to now move back and talk about reincorporating a little bit of light and kind of building up the highlights in very specific areas to make the background more interesting but not overcomplicated. Now as we step back, there is something I'd like to take note of, and that is this area right here. On the screen, and from different angles of the painting, that's going to look quite bright because it's reflective right now, because it's wet. Again, water-based paint. So this can be a little deceiving depending upon where you're sitting, how you're painting. You might say, oh, that looks a little too bright. I'll make it darker. Go back in, add another dark layer. When in all actuality, it really is just a reflection and not something you have to worry about. In 10 minutes, it's not going to look like that. So this is a little reminder to step back once in a while, walk around your painting before you make any drastic decisions. Just try to make sure that what you're seeing is an actual proper representation of what you're looking at. So that said, we are now going to add some highlights back into here. Something I like to do with these very moody skies is I like to add a little bit of highlight right at the top under some of these edges. And I do that because this blue that we see, that's not the actual sky. That is more illuminated clouds behind these darker clouds in the foreground. So we're going to add some extra light, still using that 1/4 inch round pointed brush, grab some titanium white, and the goal now is going to make something brighter than what we have right here. So I'll actually mix on top of it. We have a lot to kind of work with spatially. I can tell that that's a little bit too gray. What do we do if the color is too gray? We just add hue back into it. So we add some of our cerulean blue, and already I think I have something that I'm quite happy with. So now what we do is we take our pinky finger, we ground it on the canvas. I'm actually just making my brush a little bit more damp, but we ground our pinky finger, that way we eliminate some shake from our hand, and we can work right under that darker cloud. And then I like to soften it as I work downwards. So I'm just using very light little tapping strokes to make it kind of sink in to those darker colors that we have right down below. We'll grab some extra titanium white, some extra cerulean blue, we'll remix, hint of Mars black. Now you can see this is brighter than our last application, so yet again, going to add a little bit more of a highlight. I'm not going to drag this far down though, because I don't want it to actually become bright. And if you find it gets a little messy on top of your darker application, that's okay. You can always go back and just reapply that darker edge. I also note that I put my pinky finger down here. It's something that I do sometimes, I don't do other times. Generally, I find that I kind of get worse at painting as I forget to eat and kind of skip through meals as I do paint. That generally does make me a little bit more shaky. And it's a good reminder actually to take little breaks here and there. Make sure that you're getting hydrated, make sure that you're eating appropriately. It's so easy to get lost in paintings, and I do it all the time. But do ensure that you're also being healthy through the process and you're getting the nutrients that you need. The painting process does kind of tell you when you need to. It's very convenient and very inconvenient. It's kind of all of the things. But here we go. The little tapping effect that we're doing is creating a nice little texture in there, by the way. It's making it look like there's little volumes of cloud. I like it a lot. There we go. Of course, it's all very wet right now, very reflective. As the paint dries, it will look darker. Here you can see I'm blending up into this cloud on an angle. Make it a bit more dynamic, interesting. Now I think we'll take a couple of steps back and just make sure we're on the right track. So far, I think it looks even better from a distance. Always love when that happens, because realistically, when you enter a room, when you're looking at a painting, you're not 1 foot away from it. you're 5 feet away from it, you're 10 feet away from it, you don't generally see all of those little brush strokes. What you see is the painting as a whole. And when we start to do all of these little detailed areas, it can be very easy to zero in on a specific thing, work very hard on it, and really enhance it, unfortunately to the point where it takes away from other subjects. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you are taking 5-6 steps back every once in a while, ensure that the painting is progressing as you want it to, and you know, here we did get lucky. I think it is moving in the right direction. But with that, we have some nice applications down here. I think what would be a great idea is kind of moving some highlights up into here, into this area. So my brush is a little bit wet right now, so perhaps you can kind of see just that reflective brush stroke, but it's how I'm mapping and drawing on the canvas. It's a very quick and easy way of figuring things out, and it goes away in a couple seconds, but it's good as a learning tool. That said, we want a color that's almost as dark as this, so I'll start with some Mars black, some cerulean blue, very small amount of titanium white. I'll test it kind of on the edge of the canvas. I can tell that's a little bit too bright. Grab some extra Mars black. Test that on the edge, and that looks great. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, you know what? This is an edge of the cloud. It's probably going to wrap around this way, and then it'll re-emerge up here. So here we have this larger, darker cloud, right? It's in front of the cloud in the background, which has a bit more light. So we create that edge, and then I'm blending up using the edge of the brush. You can hold your brush like this, work in a bit of a circular motion, a bit of water on your brush, and create this light, which is just going to work on the cloud in the background. What's great about this is it brightens portions of this background so that this can stand out more when it comes time to really incorporate it. And the reason we're doing this now rather than when we were painting the actual background is it's a lot easier. It lets you kind of decide later on where exactly you want these things. And we don't have to worry about blending all of this wet into wet at once, which is generally, with acrylics, a bit more difficult because it does dry so much more quickly. So there, we're off to a great start. We can even grab a little bit of our highlight if we still have it wet. Not sure if we do. We're about to find out. Apply that to the edge. Start blending up a little bit. I think that looks really nice. And then we can kind of reshape, add more interesting little features. This is, again, isn't necessarily something that's in the reference photo. I am using the reference photo. I'm kind of, tapping it with different colors, making sure that the color is correct here before I kind of apply it to here. That way we don't kind of ruin things, and we have a good starting point. But again, don't feel like it's ever handcuffing you. Feel like you can deviate if there's good reason to. And so far, I really like the way that's turning out. I think I want to create another one right around here, but I'll get you a little bit closer for that. Now, something fun we can do here, now that we have this established, is we can kind of move it forward in the painting. Here I have more cerulean blue. We'll grab more of our Mars black, hint of titanium white, and now we essentially have our highlight. So let's say hypothetically this follows through here. Just testing, you know what, that's a little bit too dark. And this is why we test first. Try that. Okay, I like that a lot better. So hypothetically we follow this over through here, and it's going to work like that. Then we're going to find it on the other side. So here you can see I'm already establishing this cloud, this darker cloud on top of these lighter clouds. So now I'm moving down these highlights. And okay, we follow the top, we say, okay, maybe it moves this way, maybe it gets a little bigger, maybe it gets smaller again. You might want to sketch some of this out, find your composition. I've been doing this for a while, so I can kind of see it in my head. But if you're not entirely comfortable or confident with how you're going to have these clouds progress, then it's just an easy way of going about it and making sure that you're not doing something you don't want to. So, there we go. We have this nice cloud that moves from one side to the other. And now this area right here is another darker cloud, and it looks kind of awkward. It looks a little bit too complicated for this area. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cover it up. And this, if anything, should act as a real reminder that acrylics are incredibly forgiving. Don't be afraid to try things, to have fun with it. You can always take things out, cover things up, redo things. That's one of the reasons people really love working with acrylics. It's just so forgiving. We can try a lot of different ideas very quickly. There we go. And we are very quickly coming to an interesting but not overcomplicated sky. With that, I think we're going to do a little bit more reworking down here. I'll move the camera down, and then we'll move on to the rest of the painting. Now, right down here is essentially right beside where a lot of the volcanic eruption is going to be occurring, so we're going to have some very bright applications right here, which means if we want that to pop, and we definitely want that to pop because it's the main portion of our main subject, we're going to want to make this area a little bit darker. So we ask ourselves, in the context of the painting, how do we facilitate that idea? This is a big dark cloud. That would be perfect right here. Would adding this right here, right there, make sense? Would it visually work? I don't think it would be a bad idea, and I think we can kind of continue moving this over here. So again, we have another bridge. Generally, you want more than 2 patterns, more than 2 of the same subjects. You generally want to work in odd numbers, 3, 5, 7, 9, etc., because it's a bit more visually dynamic. It keeps the viewer engaged for a longer period of time. So if we do this, we kind of need to commit to another third subject that kind of acts as this horizontal bridge. But again, this is how paintings evolve and how you really want to think about paintings. I again really want these lessons to be something that can aid you in the future with your own pieces and with every other piece you do going forward, rather than just, this is how you paint this perfect piece specifically, right? So we are going to take some detours. We're going to try some different things, but we'll also talk about the theory, the reasoning behind why we're making these changes. So here I should have that dark color. We'll test it over here. Why right here specifically? Because this is what we are bringing over into this area. So that looked great. I'm going to continue it farther down, really covering up all of the area beside the explosive part of this volcano. So I like that so far. I think it needs a bit more of an interesting progression though. So we're just going to keep it moving. I might brighten this a little bit. I might create an opening there, just like a very small one. You can have this start to come up again. You can see that as we run out of paint and the water on our brush remains, we do get a bit more of a soft transition over here. We'll break this apart a little bit. Things are feeling a bit more cohesive now. And you know what? This can be our third little bridge. Very subtle, but it'll do it. We also now have a lot of horizontal pieces, which will be really neat because we have this very large vertical piece. So the painting isn't all going to be visually moving you up. You're going to have all of these different other things to kind of catch your eye and keep you engaged. It isn't solved in the first look. And that's also great. It's subconscious. It's not something a lot of people think about when they craft their paintings, but it does make a difference over time, and it can make a painting a lot more visually appealing in the long term. So very much like that. Grab a little bit more blue, white, create a bit of a highlight, similar to what we have here. Let's test it. Oh, we are getting good. I love it. And we're just going to do a little bit right here. Not much of a blend, just small little opening. I think this will look fantastic once we have the actual volcano and eruption worked in. I think it has a lot of promise. So, with that, we are going to work on the actual volcano, and I think that's our next step. So, let's move the camera down a little bit. Let's cover this with a base layer, start having some fun. So now we're going to hop back over to the 1-inch flat-headed brush because again it does create those nice sharp edges for the volcano and it can carry a lot of paint. We have also introduced a cadmium red light hue to the palette right here, and we're going to start by making this a bit of a silhouette, then we'll add the lava on top of it. So we're starting with something very dark and very basic. I will grab some of my Mars Black. We'll find a new spot here on our palette. We'll grab some of our cadmium red light hue, grab a hint of our titanium white, because while we want it to be dark, we still want it to have a little bit of color, either a little bit of warmth or a little bit of coolness. In this case, we're working with the red, so it'll be warmth, but as we get towards the bottom, we'll incorporate more blues. So, going to begin with my new pigment by working on the edge of the volcano. You always want to start with the edges when you have the most paint, or rather the most newly mixed paint on your brush, because you'll be able to apply the most sharp, consistent application, and then from there you start your blend down and inwards, just like this. What you don't want to do is start scraping it to the point where you get this very inconsistent looking application, which is incredibly thin. You'll have to do 10 layers if you go ahead in that manner. So try to use more paint. If you feel like you can't stretch the paint very far without keeping a nice consistent base, then don't continue stretching it. Just go back to your palette and grab some more. That's what we're going to do right here. That said, I really don't have that much on my palette, so we'll have to do some more mixing. We started with a very minimal amount because that really is the ideal way of going about it, making sure that your color is actually what you want it to be in the first place, especially when you are mixing a new color. And then once you are assured, once you know you have what you actually want, then you can start getting into the larger mixes, like what we have here. Now that we have that large mix, look how easily this goes on, no scraping needed. Nice, thick layers. We'll probably still want to go in and do a secondary layer regardless, but it's nice when it just looks right from the beginning. We'll also work on this edge, and we have something quite interesting right here. What is that? In the reference photo, it's sky, and it could be sky. But I also feel like it might be better as distant mountains, something else. So I'm going to keep that as a blank area on our canvas for the next little while. And we'll decide a little bit later on once you have a better feel for what the painting actually looks like. It's a little counter to our initial method of doing the background first and then working our way to the foreground, but that's okay to do once in a while. It's a general rule, and you can break those. With that, we're now going to mix a bit more Mars Black, a bit more titanium white into our mixture. It still has the red in it, but not as much. We're going to start working in our volcano, doing a little bit of a blend to the previous areas of the volcano. And I think when a lot of people blend, they kind of work just in the same direction of the subject. I like to do a little bit of an X-shaped pattern. That way we're taking this pigment, dragging it into here, this pigment, dragging it into there. It's just an easy way of getting that pigment to blend to a farther extent. And then after, I go with more of that very typical blend style of more so in the direction of the actual subject's edge. I think we'll probably have this move down to here. Already at the point where we need new pigment. Again, more Mars black, more titanium white. And now I think we'll grab a little bit of cerulean blue. Make it a bit more cool. Just going to line this around the edges. Blend it back into everything. And as we get down towards here, we'll just use significantly more Mars black and make it actually nice, dark, and a little bit blue. So the edges where the lava is are going to be warmer because of the light from the lava, and everything else will just get that nice blue reflection from the sky. With that, I'm probably going to finish this, do another layer. So rather than you watching me paint the same almost flat color twice, I'm just going to skip ahead, and I will see you in just a second. So as you can see, I went ahead, did the second layer of that. Definitely looks significantly more thick, a lot better, despite the fact that it is a fairly non-complex base layer. There's a lot going on there, these very slight, subtle gradients, but you can still tell that there is a secondary layer of paint. The white from the canvas isn't showing through, and it just looks significantly more professional. That said, I also went ahead and I took this color, and I put it right over here. So very simple solution to that side. I was thinking a lot about it, and particularly the fire on the beach painting that we did quite some time ago, just how well the oranges, the yellows, and this blue specifically worked. And I thought, you know what, we could just use a little bit more in the painting and maybe recreate some of that magic that we had in that previous piece. So I did decide to work with that blue, and this is your friendly reminder to look back at your previously established pieces, which ones you really love, the elements of them that you really love, and how you can incorporate that into your future paintings as well. That noted, we are now at a place where we could start working on some lava, create some detail in here, but what we actually want to do is create the smoke, or at least the very basic base layer for it. So we're going to move up in the painting, and we're going to do yet another base layer. Now, while we want some fairly soft rounded edges like what we have here in our smoke, we are going to still use this brush for the time being because it is quite a large surface area, and doing so with the round pointed brush would take quite some time. Probably wouldn't get as consistent of applications as we'd actually like, so we're going to begin with this. I'm also going to begin by creating a bit of a red and black and a little bit of titanium white mix. We want it to be quite dark, almost as dark as the volcano, but maybe just a hint brighter. We definitely want it to be a warmer base though, so I am using quite a bit of red in this mixture right here. It's subtle. Can't really tell on camera. You can tell in person, and that's kind of that line you want to draw. You can take out your phone, look at it there. But there we go. We have a really nice dark red pigment, and this is what I'm going to use for this area. Now I'll cut along the edge of the volcano, do a little bit of a blend up. We'll be fairly wary of our edges, kind of create that very small little in-between spot where you can still see the canvas. And this area of the smoke is as red as it is because it's going to get a lot of light bouncing off of it from the actual eruption. However, as we get higher up, we move away from that eruption. Light dissipates, and instead, we get a lot more of a reaction of the light from the rest of the cloud. So, now what we do is we grab quite a bit of cerulean blue, some Mars black, same as what we did in the volcano. We're just creating these very subtle, slight progressions of color, and ensuring our silhouettes aren't just silhouettes. There's something a little bit more complicated, a little bit more interesting. Give it some extra depth, and Generally, when you add a color into a silhouette, you just give it more of a mood, more of an atmosphere. It fits in with the rest of the painting because the rest of the painting is comprised of color, right? So we're just making things fit in a little bit better. Grab a little bit more blue. And as I get closer to the top, I am going to make it darker and darker. So I probably won't add any additional titanium white into this mixture. And I do want this to be the darkest pigment in the sky. So if it's not quite as dark as what we have to the left or to the right, we probably add some more Mars Black. I think it's debatably there, but I still want that Mars Black anyway. Still going to have some color in it, still going to have some blue, still probably have a little bit of red. The purple that they mix together though, the purple they mix together will never be strong because cerulean blue leans more towards green. Cadmium red light hue is a red. Red and green are complementary colors, so while they're beside each other, they make each other pop, but when they're mixed together, they desaturate one another. So the cerulean blue and the red are actually going to desaturate each other when mixed. They'll get a little bit more purple because blue and red mix to make purple, but for the most part, you're going to be looking at something much more desaturated. And if you want ever a strong purple, then you're probably going to want to work with a primary red and maybe an ultramarine blue. Because primary red is a red, but it leans a little bit more towards blues, which is great. Means it'll blend better with blue. And your ultramarine blue is a bit of a warmer blue. It's a little bit closer to purple and red on the color wheel, so it's just naturally going to work extremely well. So if you want a very subtle purple, a cadmium red light hue, and a cerulean blue, fantastic. If you want a very prominent purple, primary red, ultramarine blue. We use them sometimes in our lessons. I think we actually used them in our last painting lesson, but here doing something different, showing you just how slightly different colors can make a fairly large difference. That said, very happy with that, and we can move on to our round pointed brush. We can wait for everything to dry, or we can just go for it. I think I'm personally going to wait for it all to dry. That way I don't accidentally rip up any of the paint we have here with a watery mixture, but it really is up to you and how you like to work. So we've gone ahead and waited a couple of minutes. For the most part, it is fully dry. Debatably, you could use another layer, but we'll see what happens when we add on the edges. So I have the reds that we want still right here on the palette. Don't really have much of them. We'll see if we can kind of use what we have here, but we may need to mix more. If we do, that really isn't an issue. That said, here, as you can see, we are using the 1/4 inch round pointed brush. Ideally, we're using the edge of our brush, getting a nice soft application. We can also blend inwards a little bit, just like that. Circular motions are generally ideal, and if you find a color discrepancy between the red that we have here and the red that was previously applied, you know that we took it from the same spot on the palette. This is just what it looks like wet, as opposed to what you just saw it looking like dry. So, good thing to consider. We're also going to grab some of our blue, Mars Black, hint of titanium white, mix up the edging color for up here. Does start to change. There we go. Now I have a lot of paint on my brush right now. You might not want that. You might want to take some of that off, make it a bit more thin. And yet again, we're going to blend into those nice reds that we have down below. We can also make some of the edges a bit more soft, so you can see how I'm just letting that kind of float out, be semi-transparent. This again is wet onto dry. It's in a technique you'll be using a lot with acrylics because they do dry so quickly. And that isn't a bad thing. You can do a lot with the wet into dry technique. Here you can see I'm just using the edge of my brush to create some softer edging, despite the fact that the base layer is fully dry. Both this base layer and this base layer, actually. That said, I think we could do a little bit more here. So I'm just using a wet brush, blending it out. And like that, I think it looks a lot more natural. Now, something quite interesting is happening in that the sun, in real life, is going behind a cloud. Always like to point this out mid-lesson, because a lot of us will have our paintings in a room which does have light that changes. Sometimes it'll be cloudy day, sometimes it'll be a bright sunny day, sometimes you'll have light X on, and your painting is going to change depending upon that lighting scheme. This is important because you might want it to look better in one lighting scheme or another. Perhaps because of where you're geographically located, you have sunny days significantly more than cloudy days, or cloudy days significantly more often than sunny days. And you want to paint it so that it looks best in the lighting scheme that those days render. So just as you paint, try to keep track of what the light's doing, when you like your painting visually best, and if you feel like, oh, you know what, I like it when it's a bit more cloudy or a bit more sunny, then you know if you want to make it a little bit darker, a little bit brighter, a little bit more cool or warm, you just have so much more information. So not a bad thing. I used to get a little frustrated painting on camera with days like this, as, you know, here it gets sunny again, but it really isn't a bad thing. And there are a lot of benefits. There we go. I think this could be a bit softer, a bit more cleaned up. Might want to go back in and do that with the larger flat-headed brush though, just because this is probably going to render more brush strokes than that larger one will. Just something to consider. But I'm very happy with the edges in general. I think that looks great, and I think it'll look a whole lot better when it dries. So, the next step is actually going to be cleaning our supplies. So, as you can see, both the bristles on our brush and the water down here, it's all really quite diluted. We have a lot of blues going on, and while we've been cleaning our brushes by just dipping them in the water and wiping off the excess, that's not going to cut it for the next step, because we're going to start working with some reds and some yellows. If red and yellow touch all of this blue, we're probably going to end up with significantly more greens in our piece, and we really don't want that for this one in particular. So what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that this is crystal clear. We're going to make sure that that's as clean as it can be, and then we'll jump into our next step. So we are back with some clean water, clean brushes, and we're ready to start working on the lava. However, previously in the lesson, we've been working predominantly with the 1-inch flat-headed brush and this round pointed brush, which again is about 1/4 of an inch. It's great because it does have that sharp point at the top. We have those round edges, but it's quite large, and what we want to do here is much more detail oriented, so I'm going to switch to a smaller variant of it, yet another round pointed brush. This one, however, is about 1/8 of an inch, so when we want to work on those details, we'll really have the opportunity. With that, I have also added a new color to our palette, that being a primary yellow right here. We'll mix that with that to make some nice oranges, and of course we'll start by making sure that our brush is nice and damp. That said, here, when we look at our reference photo, you can tell that, one second, putting my palette down, you can tell that we have a lot of red as the base layer for all of the yellows and oranges that we have. So we do want to start with this red in particular and build up from there. If we were to add the yellow on top of this almost black, we'd probably get a green due to the optical blend. When you add the yellow to the black, generally you do get a bit of green. So here we're just going to start by creating a nice red base layer. We'll grab some red. We don't want it to be a pure red, so also grab a hint of Mars Black, hint of titanium white, just grabbing the smallest amount possible right here. I'll test it on my reference photo, just make sure we are moving in the right direction. This is a little bit darker than what we want, but that's great because it'll act as a nice base layer. And I'm going to begin by applying it right at the top and on the edge. Remember, when you have new clean paint, you generally want to work it in an area that does have a sharp edge because it is your best opportunity to apply it. We'll go back, grab some more red, some more black, white. We know we like our color, so we can mix more of it this time. Just like that. If it's a little bit darker or desaturated, that's not a bad thing because we will be doing a lot of layering here. And this pigment in particular is essentially going to span the entire length of our volcano. So top to bottom, just getting that in there. I'm not going to start doing a blend down and making it a lot softer like we did the clouds though. Instead, I'm going to ensure that we're creating lanes. So I say, you know what, we'll probably have another lane of this fire, this magma, this lava, actually called lava. It's only, I believe, magma when it's inside the actual volcano. But we'll start creating these. You can see that they have slight blends. They're not absolutely perfect. There we go. Already need slightly more pigment. Black, white, lots of red. Grab a bit more red. This is also something where you're going to want to do multiple layers, build it up over time. So I will go back to this first layer. And as you can see, we have a lot of pigment on our brush. So we're actually going to take some of that off and then grab a smaller, more controllable amount from our palette. You can also start combining different strands that kind of fall together. I'm personally just kind of looking at the photo for the most part, saying, okay, where is that? Where does it start? Where does it stop? And just having some fun with it again. Feel free to take artistic liberties. I'm going to start with the larger of the areas that are going to be kind of moving through here. I think I'm going to want to move it slightly more to the left-hand side as well. Here's a great example of when we start to run out of paint. The color did not change from here to here, right? But what did change was the amount of actual pigment we had. So it got significantly more semi-transparent. Here we have more pigment, and as you can see, significantly stronger visually. Go back over some of these applications. I'm not applying much pressure with my brush because the more pressure you apply, the more the bristles fan out and the larger the stroke you get. I want these to be nice and small, and then I have the opportunity, like here, to start expanding some of them, which is something we are going to want to do. Areas that have much more of a flow going on, but we want to be able to be selective with it and determine that ourselves rather than let messy brush strokes determine it. Oh my. It's it's like a switch changed, and I've lost all of my words, all of my ability to speak. As an instructor, it's not a good thing. Luckily, we can still paint, but hopefully all of this verbal tripping is just comical, enjoyable, keeps it keeps it light and friendly, as I always do intend these lessons to be. But here you can see, mixing up more of our red and actually properly articulating that fact, probably the most impressive part at this point. But with that, you can see that the majority of these kind of follow the edge of the mountain. But I'm also now going to try to start breaking that general movement so that it doesn't look predictable and boring. We want something that's progressing, changing, continuously captivating. There we go. And this is just the start. I know that we are at a place where it's going to look very unfinished, very bland, but we are going to get this to a place of being something really special. You just have to trust the process, keep painting all of those little areas that are flowing down. And it's good to kind of think about this as a liquid, right? As something that is moving, is falling, is just running down. There's a larger mountain. There we go. Let's get you a little bit closer. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take that same small brush and we're going to grab more of that red, very tiny amount on the tip, and we're going to start creating little more captivating lanes that don't necessarily follow such a strict path. You can see that this moves down in a pretty organic way. It's not linear, it just kind of falls. And we definitely want more of that. Don't want it to look structured, we don't want it to look like these paths are all kind of human-made, like they're all intentional. And the best way of going about that is just being a little bit more random. You can see how we're breaking off. And I'm not always going all the way down. I might stop halfway. All depends on how much paint we have on the brush. We're grabbing a very minute amount, so often we're not going to get that far. You can also see that we are moving into previous larger areas. And when I re-go over our larger applications, things get more red because you can't see the Mars black showing through to such an extent. There we go. This is really the detail that's going to make it special, so do spend some time really just getting it the way you actually want it to be. Don't want to take shortcuts here, don't want to rush it. If you're working on a larger canvas, do try to incorporate more detail here. It's one of those scenarios where for the most part, the more the better. And if you don't like it, you can easily walk it back by just taking more of this very dark pigment and going over it yet again. I'm also keeping it quite watery because that is going to help us create smaller applications and move the paint significantly farther. You can see I'm breaking off in many different directions from some of them. Once we have the main components down that we like, and we know we want to expand on an area, we can expand on said area by just finding a middle portion of one of these new extended pieces and expanding from there. Starting to look a bit more interesting, but also still pretty bare bones. There's a lot to be done. You can tell that this line and this line also look pretty linear. And this one's going to be from another part of the mountain that protrudes up. So I'm going to say this one's okay, and I'm actually going to expand it. Like that. But the other ones I do want to kind of break apart to the point where they don't look so visually harsh or distinguishable. So now that we have the left-hand side all filled in, I am going to continue just using that same brush and that same color over here on the right-hand side. However, things are going to change just a little bit. We aren't going to have this much going on this side because otherwise it would look a little too visually complicated. We do want one side to kind of take the visual impact, and so the other side is really just meant to complement it. Now we are going to begin, as we did with the other, by starting on the edge, making sure we have a nice clean line running down our volcano, and then we say, okay, you know what, this is essentially where the mountain peaks at varying points, and then it essentially moves down in the other direction. So we can kind of move off of these if we would like to. And we are going to have the actual explosion right here, which I don't mind making a little bit more red because we are going to make it a yellowish orange eventually. But that is essentially where it is going to be. So this is all going to get covered up eventually. Doesn't matter all that much. But what does matter is creating a nice, simple other side that is going to complement what we've been doing. We're going to try to work to get the same colors, the same values. Going to make it very thin. I'm looking at the reference photo. You know what? I'll test on the reference photo just to make sure I'm still good. Okay, still good. And now I can see that there's an area right here that I want to make a bit more thick. Just like that. Creating another line. I'm going to be very purposeful with all of the applications I make throughout here, because we do want there to be less, right? If we end up adding too many, that's okay. Again, all we have to do is mix this color, paint over it, but our lives will be a lot easier if we can just get this right from the beginning. Trying to get a really small application through there. I think that looks quite good. Have it branch out in a couple of different areas. And then I think the rest of the strands are essentially going to be strands. Don't want anything too big past what we've already incorporated there. If later on in the painting we say, you know what, I want more of this specifically, then you know what, we can go back in and we can expand, we can do more, we can make those larger pockets of lava, but at this point we really don't need to. Now that we have all of our base layers implemented there, we are going to continue building up our highlights. So for the first time we are going to grab some of our primary yellow, we'll grab the smallest hint of titanium white, and we'll make sure that this mixture is more so leaning red. We do want an orange, but we do want something on the warmer side still. The layers here, while not a Mars black, are still fairly dark. Some of them do have that Mars black showing through. So we want to ensure that we are continuing to go about this in a very safe manner. And the best way of going about that is to continue working with more red dominant applications. So here, I'm going to start applying on top of our previously applied applications, and I'm going to leave portions of the edging to be red. So here I'm essentially going over the tops of a lot of our lava, but I'm not necessarily bringing it down to the bottom of these strokes. Still trying to make very small applications. Nothing should be thick, at least initially. That's an option that we have later on, but we'll have a lot more option if we take things slow. I'm also trying to do this from a bit of a distance. You can see that I'm holding the brush fairly far back. You can also hold it like this. But we're doing this purposefully so that we can see the entirety of the painting as we paint, and we don't accidentally add too much of the highlight to any one area. We're at a point where we really do want to ensure that it's all progressing really naturally. There we go. Once you've done this for a little while, it does become second nature. Gets a lot more quick. You can see that we're covering up all of that red that we applied much more quickly than our first time applying it. We know where everything's going. It's almost like coloring at this point. And that's not a bad thing. We are going to need to go over our other side as well. The oranges are going to look particularly great beside our blues because orange and blue are complementary colors. They look great beside each other. They desaturate each other when they're mixed. So we are going to try to keep it relatively separated, but beside each other, as they are right now, just looks fantastic. Here I'm going in and adding some additional layers. As you can see, it really builds on that pop because that base layer is now orange. It's brighter. We have a lot more to work with color-wise. There we go. I'm also not applying it over all of the red areas, really just the portions I want to enhance. We are going to have red areas that we do want to remain subtle. And you should consider that when you're applying this. That said, if you overdo it, again, don't worry. What we can do is just take that base layer, cover up the application, redo the red base, and then redo this second application. Don't ever feel like you'll kind of get stuck. You can always work backwards when working with acrylics. Again, very, very forgiving. So far, so good. Now, we're going to make the mixture more yellow dominant. So we're still using a little bit of red, but not too much. And we'll use some additional titanium white. That's going to thicken our pigment. And that's important because the yellow that we're using is very thin. And we'll need to build it up. The white will help us do that. The more layers we do, the more small intricate changes we incorporate like this, the more natural the painting's going to look. Let's get you a little bit closer though, because we do have a good idea of how we want it to progress from a distance, and I think we can talk about some detail work together. I am going to just quickly pull up the reference photo. You can kind of see how we have these different lanes, different portions of red still showing through while we have all of the yellow kind of on top with that orange. So while this does look a little washed out in the camera, just remember we do have the red still showing through, and the yellow that we're going to apply is going to be pretty selective. So that said, more yellow, more titanium white, and we'll mix up a bit more because what we're working towards isn't that complicated of a mix right now. It's not something we have to be too careful with. But we'll apply this on our edge, our first real yellow. And because we applied all of that orange and red, we were actually safe with this application. It was risky initially, but we took the proper steps and we got to a place where we could be confident that it would work out. And work out it did. You can see that the applications are going on very easily. It's because my brush is quite watery. I'm skipping all of this area because I know this, and this are the areas in which are going to be the brightest. Have the most of that golden lava look. Then we can start to work back, though it isn't as visually prominent or strong because of course that pigment has kind of run out on our brush, and we just don't have that much to work with. We're also going to start amalgamating areas to a point. So I'll mix up a nice thick yellow here, and I know that I want this to be fairly thick and all kind of flowing into itself. So we're going to eliminate some detail and kind of bring that all together there. I know that I want it to be nice and thick down here as well, so I apply more pressure with my brush. It expands the actual application. And then here we have our little strands that are running. We did this with the red before. You can follow and work on top of the red to be extra safe. There we go. Starting to come together. We have a bit of depth as our colors are transitioning into one another. Being very safe with my edges because I don't want to work any of this yellow over the blue, but I also don't want to leave any of the red on the edge. Here's where those details come in. Thickening this area because, again, I do know I want it to be more prominent. So far, so good. Let's grab a little bit more white, a little bit more yellow. Again, we will go in to thicken this. Definitely like that more and more each time. Might go and do it a third time once that dries. I'm going to avoid doing that right now because while I like it and while I know I want more of it, if I were to add more right now, it might kind of take some of the other paint off because we have such an excessive amount there that it might not just be able to accept more while wet. So we're going to be a bit more patient and just let it do what it needs to do. Here I'm continuing to widen areas as I feel we kind of do need to start simplifying some portions. We're also going to do this to the other side, though this one isn't finished yet. Doing some over here will give us a better idea of how much to do over there. So we're just going to bounce back and forth for a couple minutes. Not doing too much over here though. That might already be more than I want, but I'm going to test it. I'm going to do slightly more, that way I know, and then if I don't like it I can just walk it back. Cover it up. I think that's all I want to do for now. Definitely tells me that I want more over on this side though. So we did learn something quite important through that process. And I know I want more orange specifically. So, red and yellow. A little bit of titanium white. You can see we're mixing up quite a lot of it. Going to clean my brush before I apply it to the canvas because right now it would just be pretty messy, pretty difficult to work with. Don't want that. Applying this under some of our yellows. We can make it very wet and actually use it as a wash if we would like. Just give the whole area a bit more warmth. Might end up doing that. It's good to keep an open mind as you go through your painting process. I try to approach all of this with a general idea of how I want to go about it, but I'm also always open to kind of changing the path and doing what seemingly best for the painting. There we go. While I'm really liking this, it is now starting to overlap portions of the true highlight, and we can't have that. So we will need to go back and reestablish those highlights, as I'm doing here. So far so good though. Let's grab a little bit more of this. Work it into there. Now I'm going to do a new technique where I apply the brush to the canvas and then I just let the paint kind of trail off. This can be a really beautiful technique for this type of subject, but it's something I like to do after I kind of have the majority of the structure implemented. You want to keep those small. Let's get you a little bit farther back. That way, yet again, we can work from a distance and just make sure it's all progressing the way we want it to. So when we step back, I realize that I do really like what we've accomplished so far, but I also see some flaws in it and some easy things to fix. The first thing I notice as we get farther away is that this area, particularly right in here, there's a lot of very dark applications, but I think it'll look a lot hotter, it'll look a lot more natural if we kind of make this area just up here kind of either red, orange, or more of that yellow. And then as you progress down, then we can get more to this darker color. So I'm going to take some of our red, some of our yellow, mix that up, a little bit of our titanium white, and I'm going to A, take that extra paint off my brush, but B, start holding the brush like this. It's going to give me a lot more of a loose movement. And this is generally something you kind of learn through figure drawing, and it just kind of gives you more of a flow, makes things more natural. And it's also great if you find that you tend to kind of visually make everything kind of stiff. It definitely adds a lot more life and movement. So just something to consider. Already making a really big difference. This is why we step back when we paint. We see these things that up close looked great because they were so detailed, but farther away you kind of realize that, you know what, could be a little bit better. Could do more with this. And taking out that contrast at the top was definitely a way of going about it. Now my mixture is quite watery right now, so I'm actually moving on top of some of our yellows, giving it a wash essentially. A bit of a glaze. And if you're unfamiliar, a glaze is essentially when you take a very watered down pigment, something incredibly thin, and you apply it over a previously dry part of your painting, and it changes the hue slightly, but it doesn't change any of the actual line work. So that's exactly what we're doing here. We're giving everything a bit of a warmer, more orange hue, but all of the actual detail remains the same, and it's not something we have to kind of worry about. So far, so good. Mixing up a bit more. Going back in, reestablishing some reds. All of these different almost glazes are diversifying the color in a way that we really couldn't do through mixes. And that's what makes it so interesting and captivating. You get a lot of detail without actual stroke, without form. The detail is in the color variance. It's kind of always changing in an almost unpredictable manner. And we have enough structure in here that it doesn't kind of get visually confusing when that happens. So I'm just using a lot of water on my brush and some of our orange. With acrylics, you always go through awkward phases, portions of the painting that just don't look right initially, and you kind of need to trust the process. This is a great example of doing just that. Wasn't looking fantastic. Now it's looking a little better, and I know we can make it look a lot better. Just need to keep working, add those layers, take steps back, ask ourselves what it's missing, how we can improve, what we can add. And already we are finding those answers. You can see how I'm starting to create those lanes again, keeping it moving, giving it a little bit of a swoop. Grab more. I'm going to go back to that technique that I was doing where we essentially do a little bit of a tap and then we drag back. Great technique once you have your main forms pre-established. There we go. Starting to get there. I'm getting excited. I know that things are getting a little repetitive. Normally I do like to cut out the repetitive portions for you, but I do want to show you how it does come together. How I know a lot of us when we start painting, we kind of worry that, oh, you know, it doesn't look as good as it does in the video, or it doesn't look as good as the painting the picture of the painting I'm working off of. Because when I started painting, YouTube wasn't really a thing. Kind of had to use, you know, all of these older art books. But, you know, when you're working off something, regardless, I think we all go through those feelings of it doesn't look that great, doesn't look like what I'm trying to do yet. But the key word there is yet. Because if you keep working with acrylics, you eventually get there. It's so forgiving that you can mess up 100 times and you can just retry. Do it again. Cover it up. Retry. Do it again. Try to learn why it didn't work. You know, really figure out what exactly you didn't love about that previous application. And then once you know, just jump back into it and try to remedy that past mistake. That's what I do through all of my paintings. And that's how we eventually get to the work we love. There we go. So far, so good. I'm going to grab some more red, yellow. When I do the glazes, I do eventually go back up and kind of clean up the areas that we really worked a lot on. Because sometimes while you generally intend to only change the hue, after a certain point, you can kind of start changing the actual form. And if that happens, you just want to be smart about it. You just want to be safe and go back, clean it up, make sure that the areas that you want to be very clean and distinct and distinctly one hue are exactly that. Which is, again, why you don't really have to worry through the glazing process. We can always just go back, fix these things up. If we add too much yellow in this process, we can always go back and add more of a glaze to it yet again. Now, our lava running down the side of the mountain is still not done, but we're at the point where we need to start thinking about the rest of the mountain. And for that, we're going to use some burnt umber, new color to our palette here. I'm going to work right down here on my palette just because it's where we've been working with the very dark pigments. But I'll grab a little bit of titanium white, I'll grab a little bit of Mars black. We'll mix up a nice desaturated burnt umber, and this is essentially going to be the color that we're using for the rest of the mountain to kind of create a little bit of detail, a little bit of texture. So we'll grab that and we'll say, okay, you know what, here's a peak. We'll probably have some extra rocks kind of coming down there, catching some highlight from either the sky or the lava itself. And I'm doing a little bit of a tap motion and a little bit of a drag, trying to find the edge of where the mountain would be. We'll grab some more and say, okay, mountain comes down here, maybe it separates right there. Maybe we have a bit of a ledge and then it comes back down again. We'll go up to the top of it because the top is where you're going to receive the most light coming from there. We'll do these little strokes downwards. It's very transparent at this point, not hyper noticeable. That's the way we want it. Here's some extra little applications, just helping to strengthen the amount of detail in the piece, but in a very, very subtle way. This will come down, kind of get lost behind this ledge which extends. Again, subtlety is the key. The more watery your brush is, the more subtle those applications can be. Can be. Apparently that's the word of this portion of the video, or the collection of words. But I do think it's going quite promisingly. Here I'm expanding now so it moves to the right as well. And we're just trying to figure out a good movement for the mountain so we can essentially cover all of this silhouetted space. We'll also work some portions of it into the actual mountain itself where the lava is. Not too much though. There we are. If you make it too bright, you can always go over it with a glaze of Mars Black once it's dried, or alternatively, you can use some of the colors that you have there to glaze it over with some warm pigments. That's an option. Here we can actually grab a little bit of red, yellow, burnt umber. It's predominantly burnt umber, which we need it to be. Grab some titanium white, a little bit of Mars Black. Make sure our brush is nice and clean. We can even add this to the top here. Just make it a little bit more prominent. Maybe some of that is giving it a bit of a glow. But again, subtlety is really what we're after above all in that scenario. And we can go ahead and add a lot of detail into this, but I don't want to do it yet because we're going to apply something that's going to add just so much visual information that I don't want to overdo it, and I want to do that other decision, that other application first. So we're going to take a break from this area of our painting and we're going to move up, work on some of the smoke in the actual erupting portion of this painting. So let's get a little bit closer and a little bit higher. So this is our next area right here, and as you can see in the reference, we essentially have this really warm red that moves into an orange, moves into a bit of yellow, and then moves into more of a white where the eruption is actually occurring. So I'm going to put that down, occasionally apply some pigment to it, but we know we need essentially a very bright area right here in the middle and some red around it. Because this application is going to be rather large, we're going to switch back to the slightly larger round pointed brush. This one again is about 1/4 of an inch. We're going to begin by grabbing some of our red here, moving that right down on our palette, the smallest hint of titanium white, a little bit of that, a little bit of Mars black, mix it together, and we're going to cover all of the areas that we are eventually going to make brighter with a white, an orange, a yellow. So I'm starting in the middle, and then I'm going to use the edge of the brush, which is soft, to work my way up here a little bit, working in these rounded motions. It's great for creating that smoke-like effect. This is also great for crafting regular clouds. You can hear it on the canvas. I'm not pressing hard, but it's noticeable. You want it to slowly dissipate as we move upwards. And we're off to a great start. We'll grab a little bit more, and something you can do, which will look quite nice, is you can find one of these protruding edges, go to the bottom of it, and then create this sweeping motion, do a little bit of a blend upwards, and it just looks like this part kind of protrudes, catches a bit more of our light, and then renders something quite nice. It's very wet right now, so it's quite reflective, but when it dries it'll be a lot darker. And it's a great, great little effect. There we go, just adding a little bit more. Do want to keep it subtle. Don't want it to be too distracting. We're now going to grab some of our yellow, work that into our red. Still want it to be a red dominant mix, but we will grab some titanium white. We're not adding any Mars black because we did add the yellow. We don't want it to turn into a green. Going to put this at the very base of our last application. Start doing a little bit of a blend upwards. Normally right now I'd grab some extra water, but I don't really want to do that because I don't want to thin this anymore. The yellow pigment's already thin enough. So I'm just being very light. If it doesn't really take to the canvas, then it doesn't really take to the canvas, and I just accept that. With this application anyway. So yet again, I'm finding the bottoms of the areas that essentially have the smoke protrude. I make it a relatively sharp bottom line, and then I do a little bit of a tap and a drag upwards until it dissipates. We kind of lose that effect, that highlight, which is coming from the actual volcano. And again, this is something we want to do very minimally initially, and then we can build on it. But we're getting a lot of depth very quickly here. And if we look at our reference photo again, you can see that right along the edges of this, I'm obviously doing a lot more, but I have another reference photo, different one, right here, and you can kind of see it on the edges as well. I like to always keep a couple on hand, give us different ideas as we go, but it's definitely coming along quite well. And on that note, the note of the reference photo, the traceable, all of those fun things, if this is your first time here and you are unaware, you can get the traceable and the reference photo up over on our Patreon, where every lesson I try to include those just to help aid you with the drawing process, with the color matching process. It's essentially how we keep the lights on here and, you know, make sure that we can keep making these lessons as frequently as we do. I also have my ebooks up over on Patreon where you can learn essentially everything you need to know about acrylic painting, with acrylics for beginners. We talk about what brushes to use, how to work with water, glazing, composition, the medium itself, how to blend different colors to work effectively. There are also a bunch of ebooks full of traceables for the days where you don't know what you want to work on. We also have an exclusive Facebook group where everybody posts their artwork, shares ideas, talks about different mediums, and it's just a great place to talk with other artists about work that we're all trying to make as good as we possibly can. So that is something you can find in the description of the video. But whenever I bring that up, I also like to say a big thank you to everybody who is up there supporting the channel, making this all happen. And I really do mean that. In no way would I be able to spend as much time working on these as I do without everybody who is up there supporting the channel and, you know, really providing these lessons on YouTube. It's because of you guys that I get to put these out for free, and I want to say a big thank you for, you know, providing me with the opportunity to paint for a living, to teach painting, to really just enjoy this process with you. But also thank you for providing these lessons for everybody who can't afford official art training. You do a lot for me, you do a lot for the community, and as always, I just want to say a big thank you for doing what you do and making this all happen. So thank you for supporting the channel up over on Patreon and ensuring that we can spend just hours and hours on these lessons. Here you can see we're starting to build into some brighter pigments. Looking very fiery right now. Trying to make this area the absolute brightest, and then it turns into a bit of an orange, and then into a red, and then we lose it in the darker pigment that is just a little bit above. But here, grab more of that white, more of our yellow. Continue to brighten that base. And if you find you're getting a little bit of a pushback, you're finding it's a little bit difficult to apply paint here because you've already applied so much paint, just let it dry and come back to it. It'll be really easy to work with in a couple minutes. It can be easy to kind of add too much paint and then kind of guess incorrectly as to when it dries. The canvas can only take so much wet paint, so just try to pace it as best you can. Also, I do apologize if at any point my hand has kind of gotten in the way here. It's one of those particular areas of the painting that's just so much fun, and I can kind of quickly lose track of the camera and the angle. So again, apologies. I am now considering it yet again, but if for at any point there we kind of lost it, I do apologize. Here we're really creating forms, and then if I want to soften things, I kind of use my finger. Friendly reminder that finger painting never really ends. It's always going to be a very useful technique. I think that's wonderful. Nice how you don't have to kind of replace all of your techniques as you go. No, those ones that you learned when you were, I don't know, 6, still useful to this day. Here we're doing lots of little taps, creating an almost spark-like effect, but it's a volcano. These aren't sparks. These are something much larger. This is rock exploding, lava flying out. It's chaotic, but beautiful at the same time. Such an interesting subject. I've wanted to paint a volcano for the longest time here on the channel, but couldn't ever really find the reference photo. Ended up kind of making my own with an amalgamation of other ones, putting something together that I thought was really neat. And once I had that, I said, okay, you know what? we can do this, we can make it. But I just feel like it's one of those really visually brilliant subjects that isn't really done all that much. You know, it's kind of hard to find paintings of volcanoes, especially as they're active. So again, thank you to everybody who does support the channel up over on Patreon and allows us to do these ideas that are a bit more wild, a bit more out there, things that might not do so great on YouTube, who knows, but because of that support I can, you know, try different things that aren't just, you know, the same thing you've seen every other week for the last 3 years. That said, I do love painting seascapes. You'll probably see a lot of those on the channel if you are fairly new. That is just something that's so cathartic for me. I love the beach. I love those scenes. And they are something you will probably see throughout the years very consistently. I'm also a big fan of painting fire, as you may have noticed, but it's just such an interesting, captivating subject. So far, so good. Going back in here yet again, brightening it up. And I'm actually, this is pretty interesting for acrylics actually, I'm actually building some texture. Acrylics normally dry to about 1/3 of the size when they're applied, so they'll get a lot smaller as they dry, but when you apply a lot of paint and repeatedly, you can build some texture, and we're at that point, so really, really cool. I generally avoid texture in my acrylics except with the main portion of our main subject, and that is exactly what we're working on right here. So I think it's working extremely well. It's exactly what we want. And now that we have all of this texture, we can mix a bit more of that pigment. And we can create those little dots, those little tags right down here as well. This is another technique that I wanted to incorporate that's going to make it look a lot more realistic from a distance, but I couldn't initially because I didn't know how detailed that was going to be, and that needed to be essentially the most detailed area. So we couldn't really move forward until we made a solid conclusion here. And even here I'm going to continue going back to and heightening certain applications, ideas. Really getting some volume in these. Start with that slightly broken edge. You notice that they're never almost perfect. I always have little openings in different portions. But then we start to move up. Things get a bit brighter, a bit more voluminous. Just interesting. That said, now we're back to adding these little taps, little details to the rest of our mountain. And up close, they're probably going to look like little taps, little brush strokes, but farther away, it'll make it look like there are all these little individual, interesting pieces of rock that kind of move up or down, create a much more compelling visual that, again, it's difficult to figure out in an instance. Kind of have to live with it for a while. Look at that. I can't tell you how much I wanted to do this and to fix this up earlier, just to show you that, you know, like we're not actually leaving it that bare bones, but just couldn't do it yet. Had to get a couple steps ahead before we had the opportunity. And of course, we can do significantly more of that as we move down the painting, but we are still quite high up. There we go. Kind of neat, almost looks like we have a bit of a crack in the mountain right through here. I like that a lot. But we spent a lot of time doing very detail-oriented things there. Let's take a couple of steps back, give it a good look. There are still a number of applications I want to do, but I think it's starting to come together and I'm getting pretty excited. So I went ahead and continued to incorporate those little taps throughout the bottom area here of the volcano for probably another 5-10 minutes. And it's time to start working on the really detailed part of the eruption, which is going to be done with this smaller round pointed brush, quite a bit of water, and a technique you're probably fairly familiar with if you've watched the channel for a while. We are going to create that spark-like effect, but again, we are working with a volcano. In this scenario, these are not sparks, but rather, pieces of rock, lava, all of these very interesting subjects exploding into the sky. So here I'm mixing up my first mixture. It's a bit of an orange, but it's fairly light. I'm also going to add a lot of water to my brush, grab more of my pigment, and then we hold our brush to the canvas, we peel back the bristles, and we launch lots of these little applications at the canvas. Probably not very noticeable from the distance you're at right now, but we will do some close-up shots in a little bit. I just wanted to show you a wider shot, kind of how I position myself when I do this. Remember that the mixture needs to be quite watery, so I do go back, add more water. If you get it to the point where it's almost like a watercolor, that's actually fantastic. We're going to want to do small amounts of this at a time. There we go. Now I'll get you a little bit closer and you can see it with the details. So up close, you can see the start of this effect right there. You can see a little dot there, little portions throughout, and it's definitely going to add another element to the painting. Here we'll remix some of that pigment, yellow, red, titanium white. I'm using the white because I don't want it to be too saturated. And then I just continuously go back to my water dish and add more water to this mixture, making it more and more thin. Now I'm going to put my palette down, going to put my brush up against the canvas in the direction that I want the sparks to kind of fling out at. So if I do it this way, they're going to move in this direction. If I hold it back, we can kind of get it covering everything, but you do have some option. There we go. You can see nice small portions of it working out there. I'm going to keep my palette closer to the dish of water just for this portion here rather than lifting it up, as it will be a lot easier, a lot quicker for us to do this. But here I'm now working with something slightly more yellow. So I am going to change the color that we're working with a couple of times. You can see that I'm moving throughout this. And we've kind of created a couple of lines by accident. That can happen when we're a little bit too close. We can take care of that just by using a very wet brush and separating portions, wiping it off with our finger. There we go. Just something to keep in mind. Something else you probably want to keep in mind throughout this process. We're going to get some little splatters behind whatever we're working with, so you might want to put down a painting cloth, or if you have your laptop kind of close by with the reference photo, that's also something you might want to cover up for this portion. I've definitely gotten quite a lot of paint on my computer through this process over the years. This is something I like to use for stars, for sparks, for lots of those really fun subjects that you can't render by just tapping in every little piece, because you just can't render that small of an application with a brush unless you're working with an individual bristle. And in that case, you're looking at hours. And you're probably also going to become a little too subconsciously involved in the process to the point where things look very visually repetitive. This is going to give you something that's continuously changing, diverse, interesting. It adds an element of randomness, which definitely aids the painting. Great technique all around. Big, big fan. Currently mixing more of an orange. There we go. This is a technique we really used a lot at the end of the campfire lessons as well. And when I had people sending me in images of their renditions, I think the biggest issue people had was that they just didn't do enough of these. So again, while I generally like to cut out the really repetitive parts, we're going to keep doing this together just so you can see how many times I'm going back to this portion. It's not once, it's not twice, it's not 5 times, it's so many more. And it eventually accumulates to being something really, really nice and special. You can see that the detail is being added to the bottom here. We did account for that when we were doing that. That is one reason why I didn't add an absolutely massive amount of detail. I knew that this would eventually be a big part of the painting and something we'd have to consider. That said, the amount of sparks you add is up to you as well. Here I'm going to hold my brush farther back so I can get a wider application. Now you can see it's getting them a lot higher up. Still trying to position my brush. Still trying to angle it so I get something that's moving kind of along these axes. Beautiful. Oh, I'm loving how this is turning out. Again, acrylics, all about patience, taking your time, trusting the process, adding more layers, just going back and building it up. We had that foundation on early, but need so much more than a foundation. And, you know, hours later, we get there, and we find what the painting had the potential to be. So don't give up. Don't, say, oh, I'm not good at this. Just keep working at it. You'll get there. You'll get better at it with every painting. With every painting, you'll learn something. There we go. And just rewind the video, half an hour. You'll see it in a completely different state, and hopefully that acts as a bit of a reminder that, you can get there. You can do it. We can all make this happen. Painting is just a skill we learn, and for the record, my first couple of paintings didn't look great. I think it took me till my 3rd or 4th painting where I felt like actually confident with the medium. So, don't be afraid to give it some tries. Have some fun. You might also want to try this particular effect on another canvas, as again, it is something to learn. There we go. You can tell what my fingers look like right now. Kind of funny, but definitely worth it. Acrylics, so easy to come off, just takes a little wash. Might now grab some of our titanium white, mix it into our regular mixture, add some true highlights just to the eruption here, not bringing it out far, but just ensuring that that remains the true point of visual interest. We're starting to get a lot happening, a lot going on. That area specifically is getting quite busy, so I just wanted to make sure that that's something that we stayed on top of as we continued forward. Now I definitely want something more on the reddish orange side of things. So we're mixing that up. There we go. Starting to capture that magic. Oh, I love it so much. Now, something we used to do all the time was towards the end of the painting, we'd have a bit of a keyword, a code word that you'd only know if you got this far, and then you could use it in the comments to just kind of note that you are one of the really dedicated few who do get to the end of these episodes, who do really care about learning all you can. It's kind of a point of pride, and it's always neat to see continuously who can find these words and who's kind of engaged to that level. So I think we need to come up with a word here for this. And I don't want it to be a conventional word. I don't want it to be something that's, commonly associated with volcanoes, right? I want it to be a bit more thoughtful. So, you know what? I'm just going to think about this for a second as we continue working on this. And I'll also note that here I'm crafting a bit of a orange, and I am going to put in a couple of these sparks myself. For the most part, we're going to do it with that flinging effect, but there are going to be areas where you want specific sparks, and you can incorporate them yourself in this way. That said, and I know this is going to sound a little crazy, but to me the word is dreamy. I get a very dreamy feel from this. I know it's chaotic and it's erupting, but there's something about the light and just how almost surreal it feels. We went for something that looked very visually realistic, but I think to most of us, a volcano erupting is this surreal thing, and we're watching it from afar. We don't have to experience it. It's just something you can kind of see the beauty of, right? It's not something you kind of have to associate that fear with. So, I don't know. Maybe the word's dreamy. It's definitely the feeling I get from the visual here. I'd also like to note that I don't like this one little red spark right there, the one little piece of lava exploding. That's something I am going to take out, but I'm going to wait for it to dry and cover it up. We don't want to work with it right now because it's quite wet, very water. If we try to kind of apply anything on top of it, it will move and it'll just make that spot larger. So we're going to wait to approach that one right there. I think I'm going to work with a bit more of a thick, bright yellow for some of our final applications of this technique. I'm going to put my palette down here for a second. Very close here. There we go. Beautiful. Really, really beautiful. So now, from a distance, the final step is really going to be creating that almost white, not truly a white, but something almost a white, and heading back into here because we did go ahead and reintroduce a lot of those additional little spark-like effects. So we want to ensure that this middle area is still not too complicated. Something that can command our attention and keep it in a really competent way. I think that looks absolutely fantastic. And I've also thought a lot about the general name for the painting, or at least the words that you can put in the description so we all kind of know that you made it this far. And I think it's dangerously dreamy. I think if I were to title this painting for a show, that's probably what I would go with. I think it respects what volcanoes are, what they can do, but it also notes what this painting is and the feelings that it can kind of bring out of us. So it's an interesting combination of the two. Always love it when a name is not entirely obvious, but I think that's a good mix. So if you made it this far, find a way to incorporate dangerously dreamy into your comment, or maybe you can just make that the comment. I'm not going to make this actual homework for you, but just something fun to see. Who has gotten to the end here? And I noted that I was going to do that one thing, and then here we are just adding more detail to the volcano, because sometimes it's just really hard to stop working on a painting you love, a painting you've went on a real journey with, and we definitely did that here. So with that, I would like to say a big thank you to everyone who has, stuck by, enjoyed the ride here. I wish you all the best with your renditions, and yet again, I would like to say a big thank you to everyone who does help support the channel up over on Patreon, who does make these longer lessons like this happen. And I will be adding up multiple reference images for volcanoes, so you have a wide variety to look at and kind of pick and choose from. I'll also note which one I personally used for the majority of this lesson, recognizing that I did take some artistic liberties, and I photoshopped together the one that I used using a couple of other reference photos, which I will include as well. But of course up there you also have the traceable, so if you'd like a little help with the drawing process, you can have that. Also, to anyone who is new, remember we do have the the ebooks up there, Acrylics for Beginners, everything you need to know about acrylic painting before you jump into your first one. Talk about glazing, composition, brushes, water, mixing colors, really just about all of it. We have our ebooks full of traceables for those days where you don't really know what you want to paint. There are some options. We have one on flowers, we have a couple on landscapes. Lots of fun things. But also, just by joining there, you do help support the channel in a major way. Provide me with the opportunity to make these and provide these lessons for, again, everybody else who can't really afford formal art training, which is completely understandable. It's very, very expensive. As someone who did go to university for fine art and, paid back those student loans, I can tell you it's a little costly, a little ridiculously costly. I wish I had a YouTube when I was just starting to learn to paint. But with that, thank you for being here. Thank you for supporting the channel, making all of this happen. And I do really look forward to seeing all of the renditions of this one up in our exclusive Facebook group as well. So links to Patreon and all of that in the video description. And I think it's done. I think we've completed it. It's been such a joy. Remember, when you're finishing off your painting, do so from far away. Try to paint far away. That way you can see all of it at once. But really, thank you for being here. I hope you have a wonderful day. Hope you find lots of success with this. And again, I will see you very soon with a brand new painting lesson.